It was a late afternoon, and I was tidying up the bedroom when the sound of the door creaking open startled me. I turned around to find Ryan standing in the doorway, his eyes locked onto the object in my hands. My breath caught in my chest. How on earth could I explain this? The thing wasn't exactly discreet, a large, brightly colored item that no polite conversation could excuse away. I'd only pulled it out of the drawer to clean behind the cabinet, never expecting anyone to walk in. I could have sworn I'd locked the door. Ryan, my 23-year-old stepson, wasn't supposed to be home yet. He worked at a local brewery and usually spent his evenings hanging out with friends after his shift. But there he was, tall and lanky, with messy brown hair that fell into his sharp green eyes that now sparkled with amusement. "What's that?" he asked, his tone hovering between curiosity and playful teasing. I froze, my face flushing with heat as if I'd been caught doing something scandalous. Panicking, I dropped the object as though it were on fire and grabbed the nearest thing, a throw pillow from the bed, to cover it up. "It's none of your business," I snapped, my voice shaky, my throat tightening under the weight of embarrassment. But Ryan didn't flinch. If anything, his grin widened, and he leaned casually against the doorframe. "Relax," he said, smirking. "It's not like I haven't seen stuff like that before." The audacity of this kid, well, this grown man, really left me speechless. Here I was, mortified beyond belief, and he was standing there completely unfazed, as if this was the most normal interaction in the world. Desperate to regain some control, I forced a laugh. "Ryan, seriously, get out of here. You shouldn't even be in my room." But he stayed put, the air between us growing heavier by the second. His gaze shifted, not to the pillow in my hands, but to me. It wasn't the usual casual or teasing look I'd come to expect from him. This was different, lingering too long, too intently, as if he was seeing something new in me that even I didn't recognize. I felt a strange, unwelcome flutter in my chest, quickly followed by a wave of guilt so sharp it nearly knocked me over. This was all kinds of wrong. I was his stepmother, for God's sake. I was married to his father. Shaking my head, I broke the silence. "Please, Ryan. Just go." He shrugged at last, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right, he said, his voice light again. But as he turned to leave, he glanced back at me, and there was something in his eyes, something that unsettled me more than I cared to admit. When the door clicked shut, I sank onto the edge of the bed, clutching the pillow against my chest like a shield. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't bring myself to put the item back in the drawer. Something had shifted in that moment, something invisible yet undeniable. And no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, I knew I'd never look at Ryan the same way again. That evening, I threw myself into distractions, cooking dinner, folding laundry, even sitting beside Robert, my husband, on the couch as he flipped through old westerns. But no matter what I did, Ryan's face, his amused smirk, the glint in his eyes, kept intruding on my thoughts. Not that Robert noticed. He rarely noticed much these days. Ever since his retirement, he'd buried himself in his hobbies: gardening, woodworking, crossword puzzles. I didn't blame him, resentment would have been too easy. But sometimes, I felt more like his caretaker than his wife. At one point, I glanced down the hall and saw Ryan's shadow moving in his room. Faint music seeped through his door, a steady bassline that didn't match the stillness of the rest of the house. My pulse quickened for no good reason, and I forced my attention back to Robert. He was snoring softly, his chin tucked into his chest, the TV droning on in the background. I considered waking him but decided against it. Instead, I slipped into the kitchen, grateful for a few quiet moments alone. Or so I thought. Ryan appeared a minute later, walking in barefoot and looking effortlessly relaxed in a worn-out t-shirt and sweats, his hair tousled like he'd been running his hands through it. "Hey," he said casually, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. "You're up late." "I could say the same about you," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He leaned against the counter, flashing a small smile. "Just unwinding. Living here again, it's not exactly easy." That made me pause. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his expression softening. "I don't know, just feels like I don't fit in anymore." His words caught me off guard, and I felt a pang of sympathy I wasn't expecting. Despite everything,
a flicker of maternal concern surfaced within me. It's just a temporary phase, Ryan.
You're smart, capable, and resourceful.
You'll find your footing before you know it. Thanks, Sarah, he said softly, using my name with an unfamiliar gentleness. That means a lot.
For a moment, the kitchen felt smaller, like the walls had closed in, the space between us shrinking even though neither of us moved. His gaze lingered on mine, and that same unsettling warmth bloomed in my chest. I cleared my throat quickly and turned to the counter, pretending to wipe an already clean spot.
But Ryan wasn't done.
About earlier, he began, his voice shifting back to its playful tone.
You don't have to be so embarrassed, you know. We're all human.
My hand froze mid-motion, and I turned toward him, fighting to keep my composure.
Ryan, can we not talk about that?
It was nothing, an accident.
Let's just leave it at that. Okay, he said, holding his hands up like he was surrendering. But the smirk tugging at his lips made my stomach twist.
He brushed past me on his way out, close enough that I caught the faint scent of his cologne, clean and faintly woodsy. I didn't look back, but I felt his presence linger just a moment longer before he finally walked out. That night, lying in bed next to Robert, my thoughts churned restlessly.
What was happening to me, to us, to this house?
I'd always been good at keeping boundaries in place, drawing lines that weren't meant to be crossed. But Ryan had a way of pushing those lines, sometimes without even trying.
And the worst part?
I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop.
The next morning, I fell into my usual routine, determined to keep things normal.
I made breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee for Robert, and a smoothie for myself. Ryan was the last to come into the kitchen, as usual, his hair still damp from his shower. He greeted Robert with a casual morning, but when he turned to me, his warm smile sent my heart racing. We all sat at the table, the clinking of utensils and snippets of small talk filling the air. But underneath it, there was a tension I couldn't shake. Every time Ryan's hand brushed mine as we passed the salt or the coffee pot, it felt deliberate, like he wanted me to notice. I caught him watching me more than once, his gaze steady and unreadable. Robert, as always, remained oblivious. After breakfast, Ryan surprised me by offering to help clean up. Normally, he'd retreat to his room or head out to meet his friends, so his offer caught me off guard. You don't have to, I said, stacking plates in the sink. I want to, he replied, already grabbing a dish rag. We worked side by side in silence, but the air between us felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. At one point, we both reached for a glass, and our hands collided. Neither of us pulled away immediately. You're different, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper.
What do you mean?
I asked, my throat suddenly dry. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine.
I don't know.
You're just not like other women your age. I let out a nervous laugh, stepping back to create some distance.
Well, that's flattering.
It's not just that, he continued, his tone growing more serious. You're real. You listen. You see people for who they are. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Unsure of how to respond, I turned back to the sink, busying myself with the dishes. But I could feel his presence behind me, closer than before. My pulse quickened, and I hated how much I didn't want him to step away. Sarah, where's my crossword book? Robert's voice called from the living room, breaking the moment like a splash of cold water.
Ryan stepped back, giving me a knowing smile.
I'll let you get back to him, he said lightly before leaving the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, feeling an uncomfortable mix of relief and longing.
I was playing with fire, and I knew it. But part of me couldn't help reaching toward the heat.
That afternoon, I tried to keep myself busy running errands, folding laundry, anything to keep my mind from wandering. But when I returned home, I found Ryan sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the yard.
Hey, I said softly, approaching him.
He looked up, his face breaking into a small, weary smile.
Hey. Everything okay? He hesitated before answering. Yeah.
Just thinking.
About what?
Life, I guess, he said, his eyes fixed on the horizon.
Where I'm going. Where I should be going.
I sat down beside him, keeping a safe distance but close enough to feel the warmth of his presence.
You're young, Ryan. You don't have to have it all figured out yet.
Maybe, he said with a small shrug.
Then, after a pause, he added, you ever feel like you're meant for something else? Like you're stuck in the wrong story?
His words struck a nerve I wasn't ready to confront. I wanted to offer Ryan some reassurance, to tell him things would get better, but I couldn't lie, not to him, and not to myself.
Instead, I rested a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze.
You're not trapped, I said, though my voice wavered slightly, betraying my uncertainty. For a moment, his hand covered mine, and the weight of that simple gesture felt far too intimate. I pulled away quickly, but it was already too late. Another boundary blurred, another line crossed, and I wasn't sure I had the will to stop it anymore.
That evening, the sky darkened as a storm rolled in.
The air was thick and electric, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Robert had gone to bed early, grumbling about his shoulder acting up again.
I settled into the living room with a book, but I couldn't focus.
The storm outside mirrored the one churning inside me, restless, unpredictable, and dangerous. I heard faint noises from the kitchen, the fridge door opening, the clink of a glass, the soft sound of liquid being poured.
Moments later, Ryan appeared in the doorway, holding 2 glasses.
Whiskey, he asked, one brow arched.
I blinked, caught off guard. I don't usually drink this late.
Well, maybe tonight's an exception, he said, flashing a grin as he handed me a glass, not waiting for an answer.
I hesitated, then took it.
The cool glass felt heavy in my hand as Ryan dropped into the armchair across from me, stretching out his legs like he owned the place. The soft glow from the lamp cast shadows across his face, highlighting his sharp jawline and the faint stubble on his chin.
What are you reading? He asked, nodding at the book resting in my lap. Just something light, I replied, holding it up briefly. Nothing exciting.
I find that hard to believe, he said with a smirk.
I laughed softly and took a sip of the whiskey.
It burned on the way down, but the distraction was welcome. For a while, we sat in a surprisingly comfortable silence, the storm outside rumbling louder. Then his voice broke through, low and steady.
Can I ask you something? I glanced at him warily. Depends on what it is.
He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes fixed on it like he was organizing his thoughts.
Do you ever feel stuck?
The question caught me off guard, echoing the one he'd asked earlier on the porch but now carrying a deeper weight. Sometimes, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. His eyes met mine, unflinching.
You don't seem like someone who should feel stuck. You're too alive for that. Heat rose to my cheeks, and I quickly looked away, setting my glass down on the coffee table. Ryan, you can't say things like that. Why not? It's the truth.
His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The tension in the room was suffocating, and I shot to my feet, needing to put some space between us. I think it's time we called it a night, I said, avoiding his gaze as I moved toward the door.
Before I could leave, the power went out.
The sudden darkness was disorienting. I froze mid-step, feeling my pulse quicken. It's just the storm, Ryan said, his tone calm and reassuring. I heard him move closer, the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet.
Hold on. Let me find a flashlight.
I stayed still, listening to the faint rustle of his movements. When his hand brushed mine in the dark, I gasped softly. Sorry, he murmured, but he didn't pull away. His hand lingered, warm against mine, and the air between us seemed to shift. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Sarah, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I turned toward him instinctively, even though I couldn't see him. But I could feel him, his presence, his warmth, the steady rhythm of his breathing. His hand slid up to my wrist, holding it gently.
This is a bad idea, I said, my voice trembling.
I know, he replied, but he didn't let go. The first flash of lightning lit up the room for a brief second, and in that moment, I saw his face earnest, vulnerable, and impossibly close. And then, he kissed me. At first, the kiss was soft, tentative, as though he was waiting for me to push him away.
But I didn't.
Instead, I leaned into him, gripping his shirt like he was the only steady thing in his spinning world.
When the lights flickered back on, we broke apart, breathless and wide-eyed. The gravity of what had just happened hit me like a wave, and I stepped back, my hands trembling. This can't happen," I stammered, shaking my head as though it would erase the moment. Ryan didn't argue. He stood there, his expression unreadable, his breathing still uneven. "I know," he said quietly, his voice steady despite everything. "But it already has." The next few days were a whirlwind of avoidance, stolen glances, and unspoken tension. I buried myself in chores and errands, desperate to keep my mind occupied, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the memory of his lips on mine or the way his hand had lingered on my wrist, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. One evening, as I folded laundry in the guest room, Ryan appeared in the doorway. His presence was commanding, even when he wasn't trying to be. "We need to talk," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. I didn't look up. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is." He stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. I sighed, setting down the shirt I'd been folding and turning to face him. "Ryan, whatever this is, it has to stop." "It's wrong." "Is it?" he asked, his voice calm but challenging. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a shiver through me, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "You don't understand," I said, my voice cracking. "If Robert ever found out." "He won't," Ryan interrupted, his tone more resolute now. "And even if he did, do you really think he'd care? He barely notices you anymore." His words hit their mark, and the sting of truth made me falter. But that didn't make it right. "This isn't about him," I said, my voice rising with emotion. "It's about us. Whatever this is, it can't happen. It's not just wrong, it's impossible." Ryan stepped closer, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. "Why?" he pressed. "Because you're afraid of what people might think. Or because you're afraid of what you might think." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words refused to come. "Melina," he continued, his tone softening. "I'm not trying to make this harder for you, but I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. And I don't think you can either." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I turned away, unable to face him. "You don't understand," I whispered. "Then explain it to me," he pleaded. But I couldn't. I couldn't articulate the war raging inside me, the guilt, the fear, the longing. So instead, I shook my head and pushed past him, leaving the room without another word. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Robert's steady breathing filled the silence. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions I couldn't unravel. Eventually, I slipped out of bed, hoping a glass of water would calm my nerves. But as I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Ryan's door was open, and he was standing there, leaning against the frame as though he'd been waiting for me. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and unreadable. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the silence between us heavy and charged. Then, without a word, I turned and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me. But even as I climbed back into bed, I knew this wasn't over. Whatever this was between us, this impossible, dangerous thing, it wasn't going away. And I wasn't sure I wanted it to. The next time it happened, there was no storm to blame, no flickering lights to obscure the truth. This time, it was deliberate. I was in the laundry room, pulling warm towels from the dryer. The repetitive rhythm of folding them offered a temporary escape, a semblance of normalcy. The house was quiet. Robert had gone to a friend's to watch a game, and I thought I was alone. Then I heard the soft creak of the floorboards behind me. "You're always working," Ryan said, his voice light, but there was something unspoken underneath it. I didn't turn around. "Someone has to," I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. He chuckled softly. "Fair enough. But don't you ever get tired of it?" "Tired of what?" I asked, still not facing him. "Taking care of everything. Taking care of everyone. When's the last time someone took care of you?" His words pierced through me, sharp and unrelenting. I turned then, clutching a folded towel to my chest like it could protect me. Ryan, I don't think this is a conversation we should be having.
Why not? He asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked relaxed, but his eyes betrayed him, intense and searching.
Because, I said, my voice faltering, it's not appropriate.
Appropriate, he repeated, as if testing the word.
That's not the same as honest, though, is it?
I wanted to argue, to say something that would shut him down before he could take this any further. But before I could find the words, he stepped closer, closing the space between us. You don't have to pretend with me, Melina, he said softly, his voice as steady as his gaze. I see you, the way you carry this house, the way you keep everything together while everyone else just takes, Alden said, his voice low but firm.
Don't you think you deserve something for yourself? My throat tightened.
The words struck a chord deep within me, one I had tried to ignore for years. I shook my head, stepping back until the counter pressed against my hips.
Alden, whatever this is, it has to stop. He reached out, his fingers grazing mine.
It was such a small, simple touch, but it felt like the ground beneath me was shifting. Tell me you don't feel it too, he whispered, his voice raw with vulnerability. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out.
I couldn't tell him that.
I couldn't lie to him or to myself. And then, just like that night in the living room, he kissed me. Only this time, I didn't stop him.
The days that followed blurred into a haze of stolen moments and whispered secrets.
We were careful, or at least we thought we were. Alden was skilled at finding excuses to linger in the same room, offering to help with dinner, fixing a broken cabinet door, even volunteering to run errands with me. At first, it was thrilling, the rush of something forbidden igniting a fire I hadn't felt in years.
But the reality of what we were doing weighed on me like a stone. I knew it couldn't last.
I knew it was only a matter of time before everything unraveled. One afternoon, as I was putting away groceries, Alden came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist.
I stiffened, my eyes darting to the doorway.
Alden, I hissed, trying to pull away.
Victor could walk in any minute.
He's at the hardware store, Alden said, his tone calm and confident.
Relax. But I couldn't relax anymore. The paranoia was starting to consume me. Every time Victor looked at me, I wondered if he knew.
Every time Bethany, our nosy neighbor, waved at me from across the street, I felt like she could see straight through me. I turned to face Alden, my expression serious.
We need to talk.
About what? He asked, his voice carefully neutral.
About this. About us.
His jaw tightened, a flicker of anger crossing his face.
What about us?
This has to stop, I said, forcing the words out even as my heart clenched.
It's too risky. It's not fair to Victor. Fair to Victor?
Alden repeated, his voice rising with frustration.
What about fair to you? Do you even hear yourself? You're so busy worrying about him that you don't even think about what you want.
What I want doesn't matter, I snapped, trying to end the argument before it spiraled out of control. That's bullshit, Alden shot back, his voice breaking through my defenses.
You deserve to be happy, Melina. You deserve to be with someone who actually sees you.
His words hung in the air like a heavy weight. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't.
Deep down, I knew he was right.
The breaking point came a few weeks later. Victor had invited Bethany and her husband over for dinner, and I did my best to play the perfect hostess. But Bethany's sharp eyes seemed to follow me all night, her probing questions laced with unspoken suspicion.
After dinner, as I cleaned up in the kitchen, Bethany cornered me.
You've been awfully distracted lately, she said, her tone casual but her eyes piercing.
Just busy, I replied, forcing a smile. You know how it is.
She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice.
Does Victor know? My heart stopped. Know what?
She shrugged, her expression unreadable.
Whatever's going on with you and Alden.
I felt the ground drop out from under me. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice shaking. Bethany smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes.
Just be careful, Melina. Secrets have a way of coming out.
That night, I lay in bed, replaying Bethany's words over and over. The weight of her suspicion was unbearable, and I felt like I was drowning. The next morning, Alden found me in the garden, yanking weeds out of the soil with more force than necessary. "You're avoiding me," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "I'm trying to protect us," I replied, not looking up. "Protect us from what?" he asked, stepping closer. "From this blowing up in our faces," I said, standing and wiping my hands on my jeans.
"Bethany knows, Alden. She knows."
His expression darkened.
"How could she know?"
"I don't know, but she does," I said, my voice rising. "And if she tells Victor?" "She won't," he said firmly.
"You don't know that," I snapped, my fears spilling over. "You don't understand how dangerous this is."
Alden grabbed my hand, his grip strong but gentle.
"What I understand is that I don't want to lose you." The raw emotion in his voice caught me off guard. For a moment, I didn't know what to say.
"You won't," I said finally, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But we have to be careful. For both our sakes." The days that followed were tense and fraught with unease. Bethany didn't say anything to Victor, at least, not that I knew of, but the weight of her suspicion hung over me like a cloud. Alden tried to reassure me, but even he seemed more on edge than usual. Then, one evening, Victor came home earlier than expected. Victor's words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable.
"I know."
My stomach plummeted, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, and I grasped the edge of the counter to steady myself. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Victor's gaze didn't waver. His eyes burned with a mix of anger, betrayal, and something else I couldn't quite place, something deeper, more haunting. "Don't insult me, Melina," he said, his voice sharp but controlled.
"I'm not an idiot."
I opened my mouth to respond, to deny it again, but the words refused to come. Instead, silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating.
"How long?"
Victor finally asked, his tone quieter now, but no less intense. I couldn't meet his eyes. "It's not what you think," I said weakly, my voice trembling. "Then tell me what it is," he shot back, his voice rising. Footsteps echoed behind him, and Alden appeared in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was set, his eyes darting between Victor and me. "Victor, calm down," Alden said, his voice steady.
"Don't tell me to calm down," Victor snapped, turning to face him.
You're my brother."
"How could you?"
The word brother hit like a slap, the weight of it pressing down on the room. "Victor," Alden began, but Victor cut him off. "Spare me the excuses," he said, his voice shaking now.
"You think I didn't notice? The way you're always around her? The way she looks at you?"
"I didn't mean for this to happen," Alden said, his voice breaking through the tension.
"But it did. And I won't apologize for how I feel."
The audacity of his words stunned me, and for a moment, the room seemed to stand still.
"How you feel?"
Victor echoed, his voice filled with disbelief.
"What about how I feel?"
"What about the fact that you've both been lying to me, going behind my back in my house?" "Victor, please," I said, finally finding my voice.
"I never meant to hurt you."
"But you did," he said, his voice cracking. His anger faltered for a moment, replaced by a raw vulnerability that made my chest ache.
"You both did."
Victor turned away, running a hand through his hair as though trying to steady himself. When he finally looked back, his face was hardened, his eyes cold. "I want you out," he said, his words directed at Alden. "Victor, let's just talk," Alden started, but Victor cut him off again. "I don't want to hear it," Victor said, his voice final.
"You've already said enough."
Alden looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and defiance.
"Melina?"
I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The weight of everything, the lies, the betrayal, the impossible choices, was too much to bear. "Go," I said finally, my voice breaking. Alden hesitated, but then he nodded, his jaw tightening. Without another word, he turned and left the room. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, each step he took away feeling like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. Victor stood in silence for a long moment before finally turning to me. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he said, his voice soft but laced with pain. And with that, he walked away, leaving me alone in the suffocating quiet of the kitchen. In the days that followed, the house felt like a shell of its former self. Victor avoided me, his cold silence more cutting than any argument could have been. Alden didn't return, and I didn't expect him to. The storm I had been dreading had finally arrived, and it had left nothing but ruins in its wake. But even amidst the wreckage, one question lingered, haunting me with every passing moment: was it worth it? And no matter how many times I tried to answer, I wasn't sure I'd ever know.